speaking to atheists. Oh, man. I'm usually speaking to very religious groups trying to explain why the scientific study of religion is okay. And I don't have to do that here. It's very relieving. Yeah, sorry. You're probably at least there are some of you out there. You're out of the closet.
Agnostics.
All right. So I've been asked to talk a little bit about this project we have. This is a result of a grant we got at UBC to study the evolution of religion, cooperation, and morality. So I'll be talking a little bit about this network. We call ourselves CERC, the Cultural Evolution of Religion Research Consortium. And basically what this is a newly established research network that's centered at UBC and SFU. So it's centered here in Vancouver. And it's funded by the 6-year grant we got from SHRC. So it'll be, we just finished our first year, so we've got 5 more years of the grant left. And the idea is to set up this partnered research network with funds to go toward a lot of different things. So postdocs, we actually have matching funds that have paid for some postdocs. So we now have I think we have 9 postdocs in the project. We have lots of graduate students we're funding. We've got money for researcher mobility and workshops, and crucially, research expenses. So research expenses really targeted at people doing interdisciplinary work, people bridging the humanities science divide. And we're hoping it's going to be accompanied soon by a new program in religious studies at UBC. So we're hoping there used to be a religious studies department at UBC. It got smushed into classical Near Eastern studies. So there's now this classical Near Eastern and religious studies department. We're trying to break the RS part of it back out and do an independent program. And that it was supposed to get done this year. Everything takes longer than you think it's going to take. But hopefully possibly as soon as fall 2014, we may have a new program up and running. I'll say a little bit about that. Just to give you a sense of the structure of the research network, it's centered here. The group that the sponsoring unit for it was this group we formed, HEC, Center for Human Evolution, Evolution, Culture, and Cognition. That was started it was basically started in a pub at UBC a few years ago, and then we got a website, and the next thing you know, we're a center. We look respectable. We're partnering with Aarhus University in Oxford. They're our senior partners. They were involved in really the ground floor planning the projects we're going to do. We actually have this very extensive network, and that's only part of it. So we've got some potential partners and also some other people in work. So it's very international, working with the universities, mostly in Europe and Asia. But right now we have about 70 co-applicants on the grant, and probably at least that many personnel coming with them in terms of graduate students and postdocs and things like that. So it's a little bit daunting sometimes, but it's it's exciting because we have so many different people involved. The basic research goal is to look at 2 puzzles. So there's one puzzle, which is, why do human beings have religion? Why are human beings religious? So as far as we know, as far as back as our archaeological record of anatomically modern human beings go, we've been doing stuff like this. We've been erecting these massive stone steles. We've been painfully scarifying ourselves. We've been engaged in all sorts of incredibly costly behaviors aimed at procreating or somehow interacting with beings that, as far as we know, don't exist. And massive amounts in some cultures, especially once you get to larger cultures, an enormous proportion of the gross national product is going into these things. So in China, the area that I work on, this is Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of Qin's grave, an enormous amount of the economic productivity of that region was buried in the ground, covered over and not seen until recently. You would think, so it's puzzling. If we saw any other species doing this, we'd be wondering what was going on. So it seems like such behavior would be weeded out by natural selection. So groups that took a huge amount of their wealth and buried it in the ground or burned it would be outcompeted by groups that didn't do that actually used it for things that make sense in terms of natural selection. So from a naturalistic perspective, religious behavior is very puzzling. So that's one big puzzle we have. Another puzzle is, how did humans manage the transition to large-scale centralized societies? So for most of our history as a species, we've lived in groups that are not that different from our primate cousins. So we've lived in these small groups, hunter-gatherers, maybe hunter-horticulturalists a bit. some of the research on this is changing the picture a little bit. It's clear that from a very early time, we've also been involved in larger trading networks and things like this. But for the most part, we were living in communities where we knew by sight most of the people we were interacting with. So somehow we moved from this to, in a very short span of time, this. Living in these enormous societies, interacting with anonymous strangers all the time, paying taxes, recycling, paying carbon taxes, not evading fares, most of us, on public transport. How does this happen? It's not clear how this transition works, because we know how social insects do it. So we know how bees and ants do it. They're all genetically identical. It all works out. It makes a lot of sense in terms of kin selection. But how primates pull it off is a bit of a mystery. So we are primates who act in some certain ways as if we're social insects. It's kind of odd. So we know that kin selection can get us some cooperation. So the issue of altruism and cooperation has been solved in part by, first of all, kin selection. So we cooperate with relatives because they're carrying copies of our genes, and so it's a very effective way to get copies of our genes to the next generation. We also know that reciprocal altruism can support certain types of altruism and cooperation. So tit for tat, I keep track of you, I cooperate with you, and then I keep track, and if you don't cooperate with me, I avoid you from then on. But reciprocal altruism, again, only works on a certain scale. You have to be able to identify people you've been interacting with. Once we get into large-scale societies, this is no longer the case. You're involved constantly in these one-off interactions with people you're never going to see again. So these things are both very powerful, but they can't be the whole story. There's something else going on, and that's the second puzzle, what that other thing is. Our central hypothesis is that the two questions are related. So the reason that this very odd behavior has not only been preserved, but has been reinforced and spread is because that's the missing question mark thing. The extra thing is religion. That's what's allowed people to solve this cooperation problem. So our central hypothesis is that something's going on at the nexus of religious behavior and large-scale cooperation that's very important. Now, the common naturalistic answer to the first puzzle, so why human beings have religion, has typically been a byproduct or spandrel story. So this is the kind of thing you'll get from Dan Dennett. We think this is right up to a point. So we think that in terms of the raw material of religious cognition, it is a byproduct of cognitive mechanisms that were designed by evolution for other purposes. So it's basically a kind of misfiring of some innate cognitive tendencies we have. But our central hypothesis is that this doesn't do the whole story. So the answer to the second puzzle, typically, how human beings manage this transition to large-scale societies, has been the resource hypothesis. So basically, we invent agriculture, suddenly we can support large populations, we start living in big groups, and then various cognitive mistakes happen. We're living in big groups, so we start thinking of each other as brothers, we start thinking of our ruler as a father, we mistake people for kin. This has been basically the resource story. Or we have some very strong institutions, top-down institutions that make people kind of be pro-social even though they don't want to. The problem with this is that it doesn't answer, first of all, how agriculture started in the first place. In most regions in the world, especially, dry farming, you could maybe see getting off the ground slowly. But in places where you've got rice agriculture, you have any place where you have these massive hydraulic systems that have to get set up, massive irrigation projects that need to get set up for the thing to even start. It's impossible to see how you could have agriculture without large-scale cooperation already happening. And in fact, some of the sites some of our teams are looking at in Turkey, these early sites, religious sites in Turkey, seem to predate agriculture. So they seem to be set up by hunter-gatherer people who were coming, for some reason, congregating in these places and setting up these enormous, very elaborately carved stone stelae that were then buried in the ground. Yeah, over a decade in places like that. That's pre-agriculture. So we see this thing going on before agriculture happened. And in terms of cognitive mistakes, so being tricked into thinking that people who are living around you are really your brothers or your cousins, human beings just aren't that stupid. There's actually been very good work done by, for instance, my colleague Joe Henrich at UBC, showing that in cultures where there's this normative idea that, let's say, everyone in your village is your brother or sister, so you call them brother and sister, you're taught they're your brother and sister, nobody's fooled. Everybody knows who their real biological siblings are. And one of the elegant ways Joe showed this is that if brothers and sisters in the cultural sense are hanging out together in a hut, nobody gets too worried about that. Or people get very worried about that, sorry. So if brothers and sisters who are biological brothers and sisters are hanging out alone in a hut, nobody gossips, no one gets upset. If brothers and sisters who are just cultural brothers and sisters are hanging out together, everyone thinks something very bad is going on. So not only people themselves, but people are tracking, people who are gossiping, are able to keep in their minds the fact that even though we're using the same word to talk about these people we're interacting with, they're not really my brother or sister. And people are also, he's got some evidence that they're also very clear about even degrees in relationship, biological relationship between people. So mistakes alone are not that powerful a motivator, and human beings just don't seem to be that gullible. Cultural information doesn't seem to be able to override our basic cognition in that way, at least in that certain domain. So a central hypothesis is that we've got these cognitive mistakes that do happen. So there are spandrels, and I'll talk about that. But in our view, they can't explain how agriculture arose. So it seems, just logically, it seems like you got to get cooperation first. And sites like Göbel Tekke and these other ones in the Mideast suggest that actually religion on this monumental scale started first before you get agriculture. And it also, you can't explain the persistence of religious belief practices in the face of massive counter pressures. There seems to be just massive prima facie selection pressures against a culture that takes its entire male workforce and uses it to build this enormous tomb to the ruler so he can have a nice afterlife. It just doesn't make any sense. And yet these things not only are maintained, but spread. It also can explain particular patterns of religious change and diffusion that we can observe through history. So we think there are particular patterns in the way that religious beliefs and practices spread that you can't explain based on any kind of spandrel story or resource story. So basically, what we think is you need these spandrels to get religious cognition off the ground. So they are a starting point. They're kind of, you get a certain kind of basic religious cognition for free as a byproduct of human evolved cognitive architecture. So for instance, the central feature here that's playing the role we think is theory of mind. So theory of mind, a good way to get a sense of what theory of mind is, I don't think I can do this from the clicker. Let's see if this video will work. So what's important to realize about this video is nothing is happening here except shapes moving around on the screen, right? Objectively, there's nothing but geometrical shapes moving around on the screen. And yet, cognitively normal human beings watching this video see a narrative unfolding, you see intentionality, you see desires, you see emotions. We don't like the big, mean black square. We're rooting for the nice little shapes, right? Everybody does this. Kids do it from a very early age, cross-culturally. That is theory of mind. So theory of mind is the perception of agency and intentionality in the world when objectively there's not intentionality or agency there. And arguably, this is something that evolved as a cognitive shortcut to help us deal with other agents. So Dan Dennett's theory, and I think Dan's right about this, is that trying to figure out a certain level of complexity and social complexity that you get with human beings. And possibly there's a debate about whether or not chimps have theory of mind. But at a certain point, trying to use physics to figure out the way people or other beings around you are going to act doesn't work anymore. So theory of mind is kind of a cognitive impression that allows us to predict the behavior of entities in the world that we set off as agents. So agents are targets for the projection of theory of mind. Agents strike us as fundamentally different from objects. So with that video, if I just showed you the squares and the circles there on a page, you think they're objects. As soon as they start moving around in a certain pattern, they become agents. Suddenly they turn into agents, and we start projecting all sorts of stuff onto them. So we see agents as fundamentally different from objects. We see mental causation as distinct from other forms of causation, like physical causation, billiard ball physics. This emerges very early in development, so very young children start to perceive intentionality in the world this way. It has a largely automatic and perceptual component, so it's not the case that we see a pattern and then we go, ooh, how can we explain that? Well, maybe there's intentionality going on there. We actually see the intentionality at a very early level of perception. So it's going on at a very early level of perception. And then there are later cognitive components that come online later on in development. But it's a really basic part of our perception of the world. It's present cross-culturally, so people have if you show that video I showed you to people around the world, they have very similar intuitions about what's going on. No one likes, people in the rainforest in Papua New Guinea don't like the black square. It's a mean black square, they like the circles, right? Everybody, Clark Barrett has this very elegant experiment where he showed these videos of they're just two dots moving in a certain pattern on the screen. He showed it to Shuar in the Amazon basin and to German subjects. And they basically describe these things, they perceive them as the same thing. Pursuing, evading, courtship, playing, chasing. Certain basic intentional patterns seem to be cued up by certain motion cues, and they're cross-cultural. It's a very elegant experiment, actually, because they show the exact same videos to these different groups of people. Theory of mind also seems to be distributed in human populations in a spectrum from autism at one end, so the deficit, people who have trouble with theory of mind are at the autistic end of the spectrum, to excessive. So paranoid schizophrenia is basically excess theory of mind. And this work has been done by somebody here in Vancouver out at SFU, Bernie Crespi, and his colleague Chris Badcock. But they've argued, and they have some pretty good evidence for this, that in human populations you do see the spectrum from extreme deficit of theory of mind. Theory of mind first came to the attention of cognitive scientists in the context of autism. But what is it that autistic people can't do? And this seems to be their specific problem they have. The innovation of Bernie and Chris's work is that they've been arguing there's also another extreme, which is basically paranoid schizophrenia, where you see intentionality everywhere, right? That's why you think people are plotting against you, why you hear voices. You see intentionality, you can't get away from intentionality. It pervades every part of your existence. And so there's the autistic spectrum at one end, the psychotic spectrum at the other end, and most of us are somewhere here in the middle. And actually the two different graphs are also, they don't quite show it in this graph, but males and females also kind of peak at different points in this. So there's some evidence that males tend to cluster more toward the autistic end of the spectrum and females toward the high theory of mind spectrum. And this, as they point out in their paper, this would actually explain the fact that religious studies scholars have been talking about for a while, that self-reported religiosity and religious participation is higher among women than men. So it may be that the raw material for religious cognition is happening much more powerfully at that end of the spectrum. The other nice thing about this is it allows you to piss off everybody. Because atheists get pissed off because you're calling them autistic, and religious people get pissed off because you're calling them psychotic. But actually, most of it, I'm sure most of us in the room are somewhere in this maybe more toward this end, somewhere in that middle balance area. So theory of mind, basically what the argument is, as the kind of byproduct expandable thing, is that as a side effect, so theory of mind evolved for dealing with other human beings, other agents, but it overfires. We tend to see it, it's dangerous to not see an agent when there is an agent, so we tend to overuse it. It tends to be a little overactive. And so we get mind-body dualism. So we get the idea when we start to think of people as not just objects, but as having minds and intentionality, we start to entertain the idea that, in fact, it's almost irresistible, an idea, that minds could be separate from bodies. So we start thinking about spirit possession. When someone's body dies, we start to think, well, maybe they're still around somewhere. So we get mind-body dualism. We get afterlife beliefs, right? If you're not your body, then when your body dies, maybe you're still around in some form. Your mind is still around. This gives you supernatural beings. So we see minds at work in the natural world. We see these amazing natural events or scary natural events, and we think someone must be behind them, right? Someone must be responsible for these things. We tend to default to intentional explanations in a lot of different areas of life. This has sometimes been called promiscuous teleology. We see intentionality in the world even when there's obviously not intentionality. We think things happen for a reason, and especially it tends to be pumped up for negative events. We tend to look for reasons. We want to know why things happen. Why did these things happen? There's no reason. We live in a meaningless, mechanistic universe. But human beings can't seem to think that way. We want to see reasons in the world. So basically, all of this kind of basic, you can almost call it folk religion. Supernatural beings, seeing meaning in the world, thinking people live after they die. You get all this for free, just as a side effect of theory of mind, basically. So religious cognition arose as this spandrel. And if you look at basic folk religion or a lot of small-scale society religion, this is kind of what the extent of it. So there's some supernatural beings or ancestors you worship. But what we think happened is that this basic form of religious cognition got latched onto by cultural evolutionary forces in a way that deepened group solidarity. So it got tweaked in a way that allowed you to tie people together better to help solve cooperation problems. So to help you get over this problem of how you're going to cooperate in groups larger than you can really keep track of in terms of reciprocal cooperation. So groups with certain types of religion, with religions that had features that help do these things, then spread at the expense of other groups. So effective cultural packages, what kind of things are good to have in a religion? Supernatural monitoring and rewards and punishments. So supernatural beings that are not just running around in the woods there doing random things, but they're actually watching you, and they're punishing or rewarding you for certain types of behavior. It especially helps if they're punishing and rewarding you for things that people care about, so pro-social norms in society. This gives you also moral realism. If you believe that supernatural beings are punishing you for violating the norms of your society, the norms of your society are not just arbitrary, they're actually grounded in some kind of bigger structure of the cosmos. Hard to fake commitment displays. So coming up with things like putting these scars on yourself or going to church every Sunday and listening to really boring sermons when you could be out playing, giving up delicious pork. There's all sorts of things. Cutting off the foreskin of the penis of your child. All these hard-to-fake commitment displays that don't make any sense unless you are committed to supernatural beings. These are not typically a feature of a lot of small-scale religions, but once you get them, it's a very powerful way to say, I'm part of your group and committed to it, and I'm not part of some other group. It allows you to start to weed people out who are not going to be good cooperators. We also think synchronous group rituals are very important. So there's some good data that just getting people together and making them march in unison or sing a song together or do things in harmony increases feeling of being part of the same group and as being a group as opposed to some other groups who aren't doing these activities. So we tend to think of all of these things as standard religious features. If you ask most people about what religions have, they would name these sort of things. But they're actually not. They're actually relatively rare. They just seem common because the religions that had them wiped out all the religions that don't have them. So the religions that don't have them are not that common anymore because they've been driven underground or wiped out or now are kind of folk traditions lying underneath bigger elite religions. So religions that managed to pick up these traits, and they probably weren't consciously designed. They just were kind of, this is why we talk about cultural evolution. A random variation, some group starts doing this. They work and they start to accrete other good features. And good features in the sense of features that help the group succeed and kill other groups. So I also want to make it clear, sometimes people say, you have this rosy picture of religion. I mean, when we're talking about pro-sociality, the flip side of that is anti-sociality towards people who aren't part of your group, right? The only reason this works is because it's tying people together into effective units that can crush or assimilate other units around them. So our central hypothesis is a group gene culture coevolution hypothesis, to be specific. So basically we think religious beliefs and behaviors in large-scale societies are linked to within group solidarity and cooperation. It is possible, so it's mostly, we think it's mostly being driven by cultural evolution, but it's been going on for long enough, there's possibility that some sort of genetic selection has been going on. But it's mainly cultural evolution that is favoring these cultural packages that allow within group solidarity and cooperation to be enhanced, and that therefore make you more effective at out-group hostility and violence toward out-group. And we're going to be pitting this, so this is our preferred hypothesis. We're going to be pitting it against pure spandrel or byproduct hypotheses. So there's still a lot of these floating around out there that religious cognition is kind of a mistake. Or the one variant of that is kind of Dan Dennett Dawkins. It's a kind of evil meme that takes over our brains, and it's a kind of parasite. So we're pitting it against the parasite hypothesis. We're also pitting it against individual genetic selection accounts. So there are some people who think that you can tell at the individual level a story about why it's genetically an adaptation to believe in religious stuff. And also group genetic selection. So there are people like, I think I put John Haidt here, who think that this is all a product of group genetic selection over the ages. And we just don't think genetic selection is quite that fast or really helps tell the whole story. But again, we're trying to formulate our hypothesis in a way that it can be pitted against these alternative ones with different predictions, and then we go and we look at some data. Now, when I present this to religious studies people, which I often do, they say, well, this sounds like Durkheim. It's kind of functionalist model of, religion and how it allows people to come together into these unified cultural groups. So they say, why should it cost $6 million? Right? So we got $3 million, we got a bunch of matching funds. It's going to end up being a lot more than that. Why do you need so much money to test this thing that Durkheim said a long time ago? So what's new about this? I think the central thing that's new about it is we're trying to formulate our hypotheses in a way that they can actually be tested against data. So formulate them in a way that they're falsifiable. And we have an enormous variety of data. So the other new thing is it's not just me, Durkheim, sitting in my office reading a couple ethnographic accounts and thinking about what I think about that. We've got teams out there collecting massive amount of data. So behavioral data, including ethnographic data from all over the world. Neuroimaging data, mathematical modeling, so models that suggest what kind of cultural forms we would need to get certain types of cooperation working, and a massive amount of historical data. So we're involving historians of religion at a very kind of basic level in this project, which is basically the field that I come from. So it's a real genuine, I think, integration of a humanities perspective and a basically scientific mode of inquiry. So we're borrowing the scientific model because I think it's got a pretty good track record. And we're trying to argue that the best way to make this work with a human level phenomenon like religion is to really involve humanities people at a basic level in the project. So we have these interdisciplinary teams. We've got the two basic teams. First of all, the historical team that's run by myself and Mark Collard at SFU. And we're doing qualitative and quantitative analyses of historical texts, so doing traditional qualitative analysis, but also using all these new techniques. I'll talk a little bit about some of those to do quantitative analysis of historical materials. Codistic analysis of religious cultural evolution. I'll talk a little bit about what that is, but looking at trees of descent and religious ideas. And we're also building this massive database of religious culture that is incredibly ambitious to the point of insanity. Perhaps. I'm still not sure it's going to work. But that's the historical team. Ethnographic experimental team run by Joe Henrich and Ara Norn-Zions doing behavioral experiments and doing them everywhere. Not just in the lab with UBC undergraduates, which is typically the standard in psychology, going out into the field, doing it with community groups, and also doing it in the field, in the ethnographic field, doing it in small-scale societies all over the world. We're doing neuroimaging work primarily at our partner Aarhus in Denmark, and also mathematical modeling. So we have mathematicians on board who are building these models of cooperation and testing them out, doing kind of agent-based models. These are currently our field site. Actually, this is already out of date. We've just got some more infusion of money. So this is about half of our current field sites. We're going to expand. We're going to at least double this. So we've got field sites all over the world, and what we're trying to do is come up with experimental protocols that can be run here in Vancouver, that can be run in Northern Ireland, where one of our sites is, but also be run in Fiji and Mauritius and these very remote sites in the Congo. So things that don't involve too much thick cultural knowledge, that you actually can translate into terms that make ecological sense to the subjects involved. And it's really hard to do. And so another feature of this is we've been really involving ethnographers at a very basic level. And we had a big meeting in May, and one of the main things that went on there was getting historians and ethnographers to tell us why these things wouldn't make sense in another culture and what would need to happen to them to make sense. So hopefully we figured this out to a certain extent. So we're hoping we're going to figure out a lot of cool stuff about religion. We also think that the broader contribution of this project is to just show that what you can do when you bridge the science-humanities divide. So a lot of my work for the past decade or so. I'm a humanities person originally by training. Something happened, cosmic rays caused a mutation, and suddenly I started getting interested in science. I retrained myself in the cognitive sciences, and part of my job at UBC has been to be an interface between humanities people and science people. And I need to go back to my people and show them that this is useful for us. Because we all know about Durkheim. We can actually answer some questions that Durkheim is interested in if we start cooperating with people who have new kinds of tools that we haven't had before. So we're really trying to create this concrete institutional framework for consilient research. So research that really integrates the science humanities in a substantive way, not just in terms of jargon or kind of lip service and doing an interpretive dance or something, but really actually bringing humanities knowledge in a substantive way. And also making it genuinely bidirectional. So not just scientists kind of telling humanities people how to do what they're doing, but taking the contribution of culture seriously. And this is something that hasn't actually happened in the cognitive science of religion. So a lot of the early work in the cognitive science of religion was done by people who knew absolutely nothing about religion, including some of my own colleagues. Really incredibly naive. Basically, for them, a lot of them, religion is kind of watered down Protestantism. That's their model of religion. Culturally very unsophisticated and just doesn't match the manifestations of religion it's taken throughout history and other cultures. So humanities people are really crucial for getting people studying religion in a scientific way to have a sophisticated idea of what religion is. We're also trying to show how conciliant approaches can solve big problems that are otherwise intractable. So I don't see any way to get a convincing answer for some of the questions we're interested in, except in this way, kind of doing empirical research at a really large scale. So to get more into specifics and explain some of the things I ran through very quickly, the ethnographic experimental team, one of the things we're working on is this basic claim we have that theory of mind is the basic building block of religious cognition. So they're looking at theory of mind, folk dualism, promiscuous teleology, and seeing if it really is the case that it's present cross-culturally, if it really is coming online in children around the same time in different cultures. We've got a bunch of, so we have child developmental psychologists involved in the project and doing this work, not just, again, in rich industrialized societies, but all over the world. We've also got people doing field observations of ritual, so trying to look at things like Durkheim's collective effervescence in an experimental way. So looking at real rituals, embedding themselves in real rituals, and trying to see if the theories we have about how ritual works on people actually really work in the real world. So we do kind of strip down, some people are doing very stripped down versions of this in the lab, but we also want to make sure that this stuff works in an ecologically valid context of the world. So these things are incredibly difficult to pull off, but one of our collaborators is Dimitris Zygoulatis, who's been doing this kind of work in Europe and in Mauritius with success. So it's hard to pull off, but it can be done. We're looking at stuff like, does priming with high God concepts differentially enhance pro-social behavior? So we're running these basically economic game experiments, again, around the world, all different types of societies. We've picked a lot of our societies because they're very nice because they have basically two layers of gods. They've got local deities, ancestor deities, and typically are amoral. They like to have sacrifice given to them, but they don't really care that much about pro-social norms. Or they're like forest spirits who kind of will mess with you if you hurt their type of tree, but otherwise they don't really care what you do. And then usually on top of these are overlaid big world religions, so Islam or Hinduism, Christianity. So we're trying to see what happens when you differentially prime those two different kinds of God concepts and see if it's the case that small-scale God concepts don't really change people's pro-social behavior, but priming them with God or Allah or something does. And we're doing this both linguistically and also in situational prime. So running the experiments in places that are designed to remind them to make salient one of these frameworks or the other. Another thing we're looking at is the moral conventional distinction. So one of our basic claims is that humans all over the world distinguish between moral claims and conventional claims. So it's bad form to wear sneakers to a wedding, but it's morally wrong to go to the wedding and kill the groom. Right? It seems like very different types of violations. There's been arguments that these are universal, that children, very early age, start to see these differences between norms. The moral norms are authority independent. They're not norms just because someone said so. They're just wrong, right or wrong. They invoke strong affect, so people get very angry when you violate them. They invoke punishment behavior, so you want to punish people who violate these norms. Whereas the shoe thing, you kind of like, he's a little bit weird, but you don't feel this need to throw him in jail or kill him. We want to see if these really are, this distinction really does exist cross-culturally. So look at the patterns of distribution. And where we do see it, we want to see if one of our claims is that what makes moral concepts special is their link to religious concepts or some kind of metaphysical concept. So the reason moral violations are so bad is because we're moral realists. We think that our moral beliefs are grounded in some kind of supernatural reality. So we want to see if this is actually the case cross-culturally. Actually, we're getting some interesting results already on this. Another thing that's relevant maybe to this group is the so-called atheism problem. So if it is the case that humans are kind of naturally prone to be religious, if we have this theory of mind and naturally kind of kicks off basic religious beliefs, why are there atheists? And atheism is not a recent phenomenon. This is a text called the Xunzi from approximately 4th century BC China. And Xunzi is a full-blown atheist. I mean, he's basically kind of Durkheimian functionalist when it comes to religion. He says, why do we do these rituals? Are there supernatural beings? No. When you pray for rain, does that make it rain? Of course not. It's going to rain or it's not going to rain. What you do has nothing to do with it. So why do we do these rituals? Well, because they bring us together and it shows social solidarity, and the people who are honored sit up high and the people who are not honored sit up low. So it shows everyone where they belong in our society. So we keep doing the rain ritual, but we do it for purely pragmatic, functionalist reasons. So there have been atheists around for a long time. The question is why? So one of the ways we're trying to get at this is, first of all, just getting clearer about the psychological typology of atheism. So atheist is a single term, but it covers all sorts of different psychologies, right? There are people who, they're militant atheists who just really have this, kind of Dawkins or Sam Harris type who really just hate religion and really want to argue against it. There are people who are atheists and are just kind of like, whatever, just don't get why people would believe this stuff, but if they want to, go ahead. I don't care. It's nice. It's pretty. There are different routes, as Ara and Will Gervais put in their paper, there are different routes to disbelief. So you can get born into an atheist culture and just kind of the idea of religious belief doesn't come up. Or there's conversions. You're born in a very religious society and you reject it as a kind of a statement. There's also a lot of people, so when it comes to this data about people who don't do religious stuff, right? A lot of those people, even if you ask them, they say they're atheists. If you push a little bit deeper, we're finding they believe all sorts of crazy supernatural stuff. They believe in aliens, or they believe in Gaia, or they think that they believe all sorts of stuff. So often atheism actually just means non-traditional spiritual beliefs. So it's a complicated category. So we're trying to get clearer just about what different types of atheists they are and what the routes to those different types of atheism might be. We're also looking at this atheism theory of mind. So we have some good data, and Ara has published some of this stuff. So has Bernie Crespi and Chris Badcock. That people with low theory of mind abilities tend to be less religious. So it's possible that so one type of atheism that Ara and Will identify is what they call mind-blind atheism, which is basically people who are pretty severely autistic and they just are cognitively incapable of conceiving of a supernatural being who cares about them and wants to interact with them. And what's interesting is often these people, if they're born into a religious culture, like the ritual part of it. So they like going to ritual events and doing things a certain way, but they tend to not report any kind of prayer activity, and they tend not to really report any kind of connection to a supernatural being. So there's kind of mind-blind atheism that's related to the theory of mind. It could be the case that people who are able to embrace consistent atheistic viewpoints are somewhere closer to this end. We're all in the balance group, maybe, but maybe we're closer to this end. So that's a possibility. So this is one of the things we're looking at. Another thing is, whether or not it's the case that even very consistent intellectual atheists still are prone to promiscuous teleology and all this sort of theory of mind stuff. So this is one of my pet theories that I've been arguing for a while at a kind of a priori level that we're trying to now look at empirically, whether or not it's the case that very committed atheists still don't like to tempt fate, still believe that things happen for a reason, still have kind of magical beliefs that if you really pick them apart, you see they're based on an idea that the universe is intentional in some way. So it's possible, and actually Deb Kellerman has some good data that even highly trained biologists and scientists, if you ask them questions about design and give them some time to respond, they'll give you the standard evolutionary response. So why did this life form arise? Well, there were lots of different variations, and some got killed off. So they give you the standard Darwinian selection story. But if you put them under any kind of time pressure at all, they revert to some kind of teleological thing. Well, because it was good for the giraffe to get the leaves, right? They stretched their necks. They wanted the leaves, so their necks got long. They'll endorse that more. Biologists will endorse that more if you put them under time pressure. So there's some evidence that actually this, even if you're an intellectual atheist, your kind of hot basic cognition is still this religious stuff. You still project theory of mind onto the world. It's just you develop the ability to suppress that when it comes to certain types of activity or certain types of intellectual production. So that's one of the things we want to look at. With a historical team, we're doing traditional qualitative analysis, so reading religious texts and exploring them qualitatively. And we've got both top-down and bottom-up projects, so things that we're designing here in Vancouver in collaboration with people we bring in and then have people do, but then also projects that are arising often at these meetings or just people in our network meeting in various ways and proposing. So bottom-up, we've got articles, books, chapters responding to all of these questions and maybe reformulating some of them. So we've already got a couple people in our team who really think that the emphasis on theism is too strong. That actually, in many parts of the world, there's non-theistic systems, so systems that don't have anthropomorphic gods. We're still doing the same work. We've got historian-initiated interdisciplinary projects, so we get historians saying, hey, this would be cool to do this stuff with my text, but I don't know anything about statistics, and I'm afraid of computers, so who will help me? And team them up with someone who can help them do the project. We've also got spontaneous, smaller teams organizing themselves at these plenary meetings we've been having, and this has worked really well. People realizing over coffee or over lunch that they have interests in common, and that they can team up in a way that will allow their expertise to fit together in a constructive way. We had our first big plenary meeting this past May, and allowed this sort of thing to happen. Top-down projects, one thing we're doing is this database of world religious cultural history. So we're building a database of everything. We've got variables concerning geography, political systems, ecological conditions, warfare, economics, and then religion and ritual, which are the ones that we're particularly interested in. This is a project we're doing and teamed up with Oxford University and the University of Connecticut. And there's a piece we have kind of laying out what the theory behind this is. Our first sample is going to be basically we picked Yellow River Valley, Indus River Valley, Latium, so the area around Rome, and then Hawaii and the Mayan lowlands. Those are our first 5 samples we're taking. So we're hoping, possibly unrealistically, that by December we're going to have those 5 regions coded, at least in the first run of coding. And then we're going to eventually expand to 10 and then 30 samples. And some of us believe we're going to keep on going and code everything, and it's going to be a project like the Foundation Trilogy. We'll eventually have our own planet and cyborgs working on that. I don't know. But that's Peter Turchin thinks he is Harry Seldon. But I think more realistically, we'll probably stop at 30, but we'll see. But we're trying to build this database up, and the reason we're doing it is because we want to be able to test hypotheses about how these types of variables interact in a very rigorous way. So this is all going to be in an interactive database. You can analyze it using any kind of combination of variables you want. It's all going to be grounded in space and time, so you can do geographic searches. It should be very powerful. But it's turned out that even designing a database like this is really much more complicated than we thought, so it's going slow. That's one thing we're doing. Another thing is trying to get humanities people to start using new techniques for exploring text and archaeological data. So what are some of these new methodologies? One is large-scale quantitative qualitative analysis. So basically, in my field, if I have a theory about, let's say, mind-body dualism in early China, I write an article expressing my opinion, and then I'll cite some text to support my opinion, maybe 10 passages. And then my colleague will write a passage, an article saying, Slingerland's totally wrong, there's no mind-body dualism, and they'll cite 5 or 10 passages that suggest that mind-body dualism is wrong. So we cherry pick these passages that support our position. And everyone, there's an implicit assumption that my passages are better than your passages, right? Mine are more representative, they more represent the general literature. We also all have intuitions about what the general overall picture in the literature is. But what no one in my field has ever done is actually just measure it. So send out teams to code everything. So this is something I did a couple of years ago with a team of coders, just qualitatively coding every occurrence of the word that, if there's a word that means mind in ancient Chinese, it's this word xin, heart mind, or xin. Coding we pulled out every occurrence of it in the entire pre-chin corpus, and then we randomly sampled half those passages and had people code them and found some very interesting patterns. So basically using team-based coding projects where you've got intercoder reliability measures to check our qualitative intuition. And in this case, a lot of things came up that were surprising to me that went against my qualitative intuition. We're also looking at semi-automated text analysis. So this is when you're basically building dictionaries and then doing text analysis using these presets. So the qualitative stuff happens at the dictionary building stage. So there's a lot of these off-the-shelf ones like Luke. So the only problem is Luke is available for a lot of different languages, but not archaic ones, which is a problem for the stuff I'm doing. But it is available in lots of languages. Off-the-shelf dictionaries, or you can generate your own dictionaries of semantic categories, so things like positive, negative emotions, or causal words, and then do searches seeing how often terms that you're interested in co-locate with these types of words. So for instance, one of my postdoc this year did a study of concepts of God in the Old and New Testament, and seeing how many times God terms are associated with positive or negative emotions, or punishment words, or mercy words, and things like that. So you can get a kind of overall, and again, historians will have qualitative intuitions about this stuff, but it's good to actually back that up with some quantitative analysis. And the fact that a lot of these textual traditions are now completely digitized is an entirely new thing. It gives us tools that were never available to historians before. The reasons we always just stuck with our qualitative intuitions is we didn't have any choice. But we do have a choice now. You can actually look at this stuff. It's all, the Chinese tradition is all digitized. It's all online. So you can search just massive amounts of data and get some really interesting patterns emerging. So calculate the frequency of use of terms and things like that. And this is Ryan Nichols, my postdoc this past year, who's been doing a lot of this work. The other thing we're looking at is fully automated data mining. So doing searches, just looking at co-locations and things like that in a completely automated way. One example of this that got some press was this piece in Science on cultural economics. How many people have read this? Big group of co-authors working with Google Book Team, basically, to use just pattern frequency, just raw frequency occurrences or co-occurrences, to look at things like the evolution of grammar, how certain grammar patterns have changed over time, detecting censorship. This I thought was the most interesting thing. Detecting censorship and suppression, so looking at the frequency of certain proper names. And what they found is if you look at proper names, they tend to peak, and then there'll be this degradation curve that is pretty gentle. If that curve goes like this, something's happening there. And they call that the signature of suppression. It's more than random. There's some active suppression of the use of this name going on. So that's kind of cool. They can detect these signatures of suppression in the literature. It's still quite crude. It's only books, which I think is a big problem. Even though it's a lot of books, it's only books. The results are mostly cutesy, I think, except for the suppression index thing. They weren't that interesting. But anyone who doesn't see the potential, the enormous potential of this, just isn't thinking carefully enough. I mean, this is really, if you get humanities people thinking up what kind of frequencies you want to see, this could be a really interesting tool in the right hand. So I think this is very promising. There's also all sorts of programs that allow you to do co-occurrence analysis. So this is basically You've got some keyword, you're interested in keyword X, and you specify the range around it, and then you find out how many times some other words appear in conjunction with this word. And we're currently using this to redo the qualitative team coding analysis we did using automated co-location methods, and on a much bigger amount of data, because now if you're doing it automatically, you don't have to pay coders $20 an hour and make them hate you because they spent their summer coding these texts. My graduate students all hate me now. The only result of this for my graduate students is they all hate me now because they had to spend their summer coding these texts. They don't have to do it anymore because we can, well, we'll see if this actually converges results-wise with what we found with the qualitative stuff. But we can do the entire preach-in corpus and up into the Han, which is just massive amount of text. So this is cool. This is very interesting stuff. Another thing we're trying to get humanities people to do is use cladistic analysis. So this is basically applying techniques that arose, so cladistics arose in the study of biological evolution. It's a mathematical tool to map out the most plausible line of descent between biological species. Right? So you use certain morphological features whenever you're using them. Now we use genes, right? But it tells you, it allows you to sort through possible descent trees and pick out the ones that are most likely the actual descent tree. What people have started doing is using this for cultural evolution. So you're looking at cultural information, variations in cultures, and trying to talk about what's the most plausible tree that will fit this data. And there's been very good results with language. For instance, the Austronesian languages, Quentin Atkinson and Russell Gray did a very cool piece on Austronesian languages. Language is relatively easy because it's a pretty conserved system. You get very small variations. The interesting stuff is whether or not you can use this to pick out more interesting types of patterns. So my colleague Mark Collard at SFU and colleagues did a study of Persian carpet patterns, and we're able to, there's a big debate in this field about which is the most plausible story about where certain patterns came from, where's the origin, how they get passed down. They demonstrated pretty convincingly using Bayesian statistics and these cladistic techniques to show that one story actually seems like it's got to be the right story. It's highly unlikely that the other one's right. So this is kind of neat stuff. We want to start, they're looking at carpets. We want to start using this to look at things like ritual forms or texts, religious texts. Where did these rituals arise? How are they passed down? So the promise for adjudicating debates long-standing debates in religious studies, I think is very strong. But again, these techniques require very sophisticated statistical techniques. Humanities people, I'm not going to learn this stuff, right? So this is why it's a team-based thing. You got to team people up with people who know how to do the stats. So we're starting to do that as well. We're starting to look at the evolution of religious forms using these techniques. So we've got all sorts of personnel all over the world exploring the potential of these tools, and crucially trying to share the insights that we get from these and access to these tools with humanities scholars across multiple disciplines. So soon we're hoping to have a part of our website that will just lay out, hey, you're interested in doing this stuff, here are the tools that are available, here's what they're good for, click here for some examples to see how they're used. We're hoping to maybe be able to buy very flexible licenses and say, we've got a license that we can share with 50 people. If you want to use this program for free, contact us. So trying to get humanities people to start using these things in their own work, whether to supplement their own qualitative work or not. So for humanists, I think that there's a whole range of exciting new techniques to supplement our old ones. We're using the power of math to check our qualitative intuitions. This is what science is fundamentally about, is using the power of math to check your qualitative intuitions. And this is something that I think we need in the humanities. Also learning the joy of working in teams to get things done you couldn't do yourself. Humanities people we have this lone wolf model. We sit alone in our offices and we read books, and then we write books. That's pretty much what we do. We don't work in teams. Working in teams, it turns out, is really pain. So now I understand why we don't work in teams. It's pretty hard. It's time-consuming. People are difficult to deal with. You got people that do things on time. It's not easy, but it enables you to start doing things you couldn't do on your own. And so we're trying to show people that this is a positive thing. There are other cognitive science and religion entities out there. We think one of the strengths of our network is that one function we're serving is integrating these already existing centers. And a lot of them weren't talking to each other. A lot of them were replicating work that was being done in other centers. So we're trying to, we have mobility funds, we have exchange of personnel to eliminate this kind of duplicated effort. And trying to get economies of scale and cooperation and specialization that would allow us to do our work in a much more sophisticated way. Exchange of best practices, and we're also trying to influence policymakers. So we think one of the big problems is that most policymakers subscribe to this kind of homo economicus model of human behavior, that we're all rational agents and we just follow the money and we kind of do whatever the optimal strategy to maximize our economic well-being is. Humans are not built like that. On that model, religion is a smokescreen for other stuff. You see people getting angry about religious things, it's really about politics or money or power or something. We're trying to get policymakers to see that actually people really do things for religious reasons. And in fact, it's a very important motivator for the So let me skip through this because I've talked about some of this stuff. That's mostly for my people. One of the things we're trying to do is also get, so flipping it around, not only getting cognitive scientists of religion more sophisticated about what religion is and what it means to do cross-cultural work, but also get them to tap this historical material. And, one of our colleagues called this data from dead minds. We've got these massive amounts of records of traces of past human cognition, and psychologists have not been using this. This helps us to get beyond this problem of weird samples. So basically the fact that most psychological research is based on North American undergraduates, mostly psychology majors, which are like the weirdest subgroup of the weirdest subgroup ever in human history. So we're trying, sorry, nothing personal, I'm not singling out anyone here. So we're hoping that claims, universalist claims about how religious cognition works can be put on firmer ground by showing this works in ancient Mayan societies, ancient Chinese societies. So this new subject pool is dead people, and there's lots of them. They're diverse. They lived all over. People have been dying all over the world for a really long time. They're a captive online audience. All these texts typically are online. You can use them for free. You don't need human subjects approval, which is crucial because it's enormously annoying to do that. You don't need to pay them. And you can get at both explicit and implicit cognition. So people think the problem with text is you're only getting at what people are explicitly saying, but you can read between the lines and get at a lot of implicit cognition in the background. So we're trying to show psychologists of religion that they got to stop just studying live people. They got to look at this huge pool of dead people they could be studying. And they need the help of humanists to tap this pool. So one of the aim of our project is to bring these two groups together. The RS program is on its way. We're hoping it's going to be one of the first department in North America that's going to really integrate cognitive science techniques and traditional techniques. So everyone's going to do the traditional stuff. They're going to learn the languages of their traditions they're studying, but they're also going to learn about this cognitive science theory and also these new methodologies. We're hoping to get a new high-profile CSR hire as part of this deal, increased presence in AAR. But mostly, I think the most exciting part is getting students, getting new religion majors involved in this kind of stuff, this kind of research. Durkheim is cool. Here's the way we can look at Durkheim stuff in a new way and apply it in a new way. So there's we have a current website that describes our project and what's going on at the moment. And thanks a lot.